There's a lot of really high functioning people out there that are struggling with substance abuse. People don't understand that alcohol is a fantastic emotional anesthetic.
In this episode, Addiction Institute specialist Jack Lambert and recovery veteran Tim Mullins join Marc Azoulay to debunk dangerous myths. We're exposing the truth behind high-functioning dependency and revealing how to build a life you actually enjoy.
Two primary aspects of substance abuse are isolation and deceit.
Same way that addiction behavior can create community, it can also create isolation.
Am I doing this by myself? Am I leaving social situations so that I can use on my own? Or do I drink a certain way when I'm around other people?
Folks with addiction are locked in the age in which the addiction became.
Guilt is, I fucked up. And shame is, I am fucked up. And that there's a distinction between those two.
If your therapist is weaponizing shame, leave that therapist.
What does the pathway look like for somebody that does want to break free from some of these addictive cycles?
Through sobriety, my life didn't immediately get better, but it sure gave me a hell of a lot more options to choose to make it better. There is something enacting outside of myself that I have to be consciously aware of. Your recovery is not the way that you learn to cope. It is the life that you're building.
There's always a way to say, okay, what do I want to do? And make that the focus.
There really is something powerful about being in a room and kind of feeling like you're falling apart and not having people leave you.
I think my advice would be become a scientist. And what I mean by that is...
Hello, and welcome back to the Men's Therapy Podcast. I'm your host, Marc Azoulay, and we're here with another one of our roundtable discussions. Those feature some of our top guests, some of the other therapists that work at MTO, and it's a way to really deep dive on a topic. So this month, we're talking about addiction. And not just substance use, not just drugs and alcohol. We're going to be talking about gambling addiction, gaming, love and sex addiction. It's a whole wide spectrum out there. And this is a great episode to listen to if you think you might have a problem, or you know somebody that might have a problem, or maybe you're just trying to decide where you fit in this whole thing. So I'm really excited to introduce our guests, and we're going to go around the table and I'd like each of you to say a little bit about who you are and what your work with addiction recovery has been. Jack, you want to go ahead and kick us off?
My name is Jack Lambert. I'm a therapist here in New York. And I received my original training at this place called the Addiction Institute here in New York, around the Hell's Kitchen area. And I worked specifically there with the Crystal Clear program, which is a program for gay men using methamphetamine. And it is a program that's still around today, part of the Addiction Institute at Mount Sinai West. And really a lot of what that program was based on was motivational interviewing and harm reduction, which are both things I'm sure we'll get into more as this topic goes on. But that's my background and kind of my entry point into the therapy and psychiatric medicine part of addiction.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm excited to hear some stories from your time there. I'm sure you...
Yeah, absolutely. Lots of stories.
Michael, you want to go ahead and go next?
I'm a gambling psychologist. I know that's an interesting combination. I've actually specialized in treatment and recovery for gambling addiction, as well as other behavioral process addictions like pornography and gaming. And I've actually moved into a different space, a little bit of a different space now. Instead of being in the clinical setting, I've become the founder of Incumental, which is a platform for gambling recovery support. And I'll also add in there prediction markets now, because prediction markets, they call themselves one thing. They don't necessarily refer to themselves as gambling, but that's also in the mix because there's a lot of similarity there. But the goal and what I'm doing, the focus now is on gambling recovery support, but we want to go beyond that too and expand it to the other behavioral and process and digital addictions as well.
And listeners, we have a phenomenal episode with Michael, so check that out. We'll link that in the description, but it really goes deep dives into this emerging world of prediction markets, of sports betting, there's all kinds of gambling and gaming out there right now. Things like microtransactions and video games. Like there's a lot of ways that especially young men are being pulled into this world. So it's really been great to get to know you, Michael. I'm excited to have another conversation and dive in deeper. So Tim, how about you? Say a little bit about yourself and your work in addiction recovery.
Yeah, I started my career about 6 years ago, came out of grad school and went into intensive outpatient addictions therapy with alcohol and other substances. We later expanded more into sex addiction and pornography. And I've been on my own for about a year now. I went to school later in life. I started grad school at age 45 after struggling with substance abuse for a long time, being in and out. I'm in a 12-step program called Adult Children of Alcoholics and Dysfunctional Families. I've been a part of that for about 11 years now. And that's when I recognized that I'd always struggled with alcohol and marijuana my whole life, but I never understood that the core of the problem was growing up in an alcoholic household and a dysfunctional family. And when I started to recognize that and started to address that as my problem, things changed. And I eventually decided to go back to school and try to help other people that are from the same background.
Awesome. Yeah, that is, it's really critical. And I like that you're bringing in that deeper layer. We'll talk about that, during the roundtable, of course, right? But often that the addiction of substance use is often just a symptom, and there's always something deeper typically going on underneath that. I guess I should say for the listeners, it's weird. I don't talk about it as much on the show anymore, but I'm also in recovery. So I'm in recovery from drugs and alcohol. I was what the clinicians call a polysubstance drug abuser, which basically means I took everything. Whatever was in front of me, I took. But my my primary addiction was marijuana. So I was smoked weed every single day from like the age of like 14 to like 24. So that was kind of my base layer. And then I would put all kinds of whatever I could find on top of that. So I'm now sober. I worked in the jail system, Boulder County Jail, working with substance use and working with drug court, things like that. People that were in there for DUIs and possession charges and stuff like that. And then my prior practice was initially really focused on recovery, and it's now since turned into MTO. And now we're focused more on men. But I feel like you really can't work with men without understanding something about addiction, abuse, and dependency. So I want to kick off with a pretty powerful question right off the gate. What do you think our industry or culture gets wrong about addiction or about dependency or about use? What is a misconception that you want to debunk right out the gate here?
One misconception I see is that people with substance abuse issues, especially harder drugs, heroin, methamphetamine, things like that, they're people living in the gutter, covering themselves with cardboard at night. There's a lot of really high functioning people out there that are struggling with substance abuse. And one thing that I see a lot is people who have become hyper competent. I know a lot of CEOs. I know a lot of high functioning people that their professional life is incredible. Their accomplishments are incredible, but their home lives are a mess. Their relationships are a mess. Their self-esteem is a mess. And sometimes it's not apparent.
I would add on to that too, this idea that, if you've tried treatment in the past and it hasn't been functioning, or you've felt like you've been caught in a cycle of relapse, that just recovery is not for you. I've heard that narrative from several people before that have been like, well, I've been trying this for years and nothing's stuck, so it feels like, well, I'm just, if I'm truly powerless over this, then I'm truly powerless over this. And so why keep trying? And I think that goes with kind of the insidious nature of addiction, and to also say, like, within the field, hopefully we're branching out into saying there are more options for treatment besides what is usually maybe the boilerplate that we approach addiction with.
I see a lot of folks who've had lived experience who are working in this space and doing some tremendous things. And I think that that's such a valuable contribution that they're making here. But I do think there's a misconception there as well, which is folks that don't have lived experience, do they still add value? And I think that, you could probably have a reasonable debate about that one. But I think that ultimately, right, even if you don't have direct lived experience, right, the question is, especially in a clinical setting, have you been able to put yourself in a position where you really have entered someone's internal experience and not just analyze it from the outside, and really understand that experience as if you can kind of embrace it yourself. And that's not just one experience, right? Because we're talking about hundreds, right? And maybe for some people, some clinicians and some professionals, even thousands of experiences that you've worked with. Like, sure, there's something very powerful about lived experience. And like I said, it does. I've seen a lot of people who work in this space do have lived experience. And I love seeing that, because I love also seeing that it becomes generative for them, right? Recovery becomes generative and they're passing it forward. That's an amazing thing. And that continues to build the connection across everybody who's in this community. But I've also seen the other side, which is you can develop like a real deep understanding by really sitting in the experience with other people. So I think both things can be true. The risk for on our side is more, hey, we can't stay purely intellectual, right? It's not all about the models and the frameworks. We have to be focused on like what it actually feels like, what the lived experience is. And people we're working with, they can feel that from us. So if we put our best effort forward and actually do that, for myself, for example, don't have a gambling history, but I've worked with hundreds of people that do, and I've absorbed those experiences, and that's informed how I approach the work that I do with everyone, to the extent that they feel like I get it at their level, even though I don't have the same gambling history.
For sure. I think that's something that's talked about a lot, right? It's like, do you have to be an addict to help an addict, basically, right? And I agree with you, Michael. It's like, I think it's more about, can you build the trust with someone that is in an addiction space? And it doesn't really matter what your past is, but I do think there is something around, giving back, around being able to, reinforce your own recovery and your own mental health by being a mentor and a role model. I know it's a huge part of the 12-step model is being that, that guide for somebody, whether it's a sponsor or just somebody good in a home group. I think that's really critical. I know that's helped me a lot keep my recovery strong, because I'm not just doing it for myself, I'm doing it for other people, and part of that was becoming, a therapist, as well as just being involved in 12-step. So I want to ask you guys kind of the next question. This is the question I'm going to start with, right? Is how do you know if you have a problem, right? How do you know if you have a problem and you need to seek treatment and you need to ask somebody about it? What are some signs that maybe our listeners can look for or self-analyze in themselves, or maybe even the people around them, and determine, hey, is this really an issue? And I guess, subsection B, question B on this, which I'm curious what you think, is there a healthy level of substance use at all? Right? Or is sobriety or abstinence, the ideal here? Or is it even possible to moderate?
The beginning of that question is really, why I enjoy motivational interviewing MI as like a standpoint, because it really begins with the questions of assessing, well, what would it be like for you to not use or drink for a week? Would that, and based on that reaction alone, I think a lot of people can kind of judge for themselves, do I think it would be the easiest thing in the world? Do I think it would be, it'd be a little bit challenging, or, I don't think I could do it, without either like having some sort of emotional reaction, or, for some folks, like I would need to detox. Like I would worry about having a seizure, or, depending on your substance of choice. So I think that question alone, there are so many, questions within motivational interviewing, but I like that one the most, because it is a quick and honest assessment of what would it be like for me to just not use for a week. You're not forcing yourself to do that, but you are asking yourself the question. And to the second point, this is, I will say I wrote a piece this month for MTO on harm reduction and some of the tenets of that. So I don't want to, speak ad nauseum to that, but I think as far as like a healthy level of use is a little bit of an oxymoron, I think, for some people. But to say, like, is there a way to use in a way that reduces overall harm? Absolutely. For some people, is harm reduction sobriety? Absolutely. So I think that this is with all things related to substance use or addiction in general. I think it is a case-by-case basis. That is why addiction is such a tailored, or should be, I think, in my opinion, such a tailored type of treatment.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it has to be deeply, deeply personal, because as you start to dig into those deeper layers, what drives people to use can be a wide variety of different issues, right? Or traumas or things like that. And I do think, maybe it's not into the misconception, I do think that's why a lot of it fails, because I think a lot of treatment programs, especially ones that maybe aren't as well funded or have to rely on things like Medicaid, they're a one size fits all. So I think you have a lot of people that get like churned through treatment and churn through these programs that can be still very expensive for the user, but they're not getting that like one-on-one real personal care, because I think for most people that are struggling with addiction, it is the most personal thing in the world, right? It is the biggest demon that they are currently facing.
Well, it's so deeply emotional, which is why I think, Michael, Tim, to the points you're making of like how emotionally impactful it is and how it goes so well hand in hand with therapy. It's like you cannot have used substances or not have had a specific type of addiction and still understand the emotional aspect of going through, of the litany of things that you can feel while undergoing the guilt, the shame, all of these things. That is on a human level. You can understand that.
I'll make a contrast here between gambling and substances, because for people who are gambling, really the only person that knows that they have a problem or that it's starting to emerge as one is themselves, usually, because they're hiding it so well, and it can be hidden really, really well. But when it comes to substances, you don't have that same phenomenon, right? It's the hiding, it's not the same way, because the evidence is very apparent. It's physical, it's biological, and it's not hidden in a bank account in the same way that privately, like gambling is. So I think when we consider the case of substance use, then if your loved ones are seeing it and telling you and noticing and trying to help you, then clearly, we've entered the territory where we have to start asking that question to ourselves: is this a problem? And I believe what's happened in this space historically, and kind of what's evolved is kind of interesting, because you have like what you see in the movies, right? Like these interventions that have taken place, like we ambush people, they're very confrontational, there's a lot of pressure, there's a lot of control, we're trying to like break them, we're trying to break through this denial, and it just feels like so high stakes and so invalidating at the same time. But I think what's actually happened now, the evolution of interventionist work, is really neat, because now we're seeing a total shift towards something that's more relational, right? It's less about cornering someone. It's more about actually reaching them and doing it in different ways that make them feel validated, not just confronted. But it's not like the confrontation goes away. It just changes, like the form that it happens through changes. So it doesn't feel so much like it's an attack or an ambush, and it feels more like it's an invitation. Like it feels more like, we're able to move beyond that whole like, oh, the defenses have come up, and now like they've entered this mode where they're feeling threatened, and then nothing's really getting through, to like, let's honor like the experience that they have. Let's invite them and let's respect their agency to make the decisions that they need and that they know that they deserve to make for themselves and for their futures. And I think that when someone feels like safe enough in that way, they're going to be way more open to, okay, I do have a problem. I can admit that, and I'm ready to take the steps to change this now.
Part of that is also giving, hopefully, like we are, like this is an example of a space that is, but giving people who can hide it and who actually take great pride in being able to hide it, a space to still be able to make that decision. It doesn't have to be the intensity of like intervention, which, comical compared to, I think, a lot of people's recovery stories. But the idea of, I've had many patients who have said part of what I prided myself on and continue to pride myself on is that I can be, a weekend warrior. I can hide this from people in my life, that I can still, like, there is something thrilling even about getting away with it, as it were. But giving, people who have that experience also a place to be able to say, but I also still want to work on this. That there is an entryway point without it needing to be, well, you've got this pile of evidence against you, that maybe some people can be curious or be kind of in a stage of change that is earlier before they actually take the step to maybe implementing that change too.
Yeah, the hiding it thing is really interesting. And Tim, I want to come to you in a moment, but from my own experience, like that was the thing, because I was really at the height of my use in college, right? And I went to Carnegie Mellon University, studied neuroscience. So a really intensive program, right? And I was getting straight A's. And for me, that justified everything. It justified my whole use behavior, because, I was going on with the cultural messaging. The messaging from my parents was basically, the message I got growing up was like, hey, as long as you're doing good in school, you can do whatever you want. School is priority one. And as long as that is handled, then you can be and do whatever you want beyond that. And I think a lot of men get that, whether it's about, achieving in school or achieving in their job or their fitness, right? There's like one thing, it's like, as long as I got this thing handled, then nothing else matters. And I think that is a really, really dangerous trap for substance use, right? And for addiction behaviors, process addictions, because, it in some ways, it made me a better student, because if I had lost that, then I would have to look at some of my addiction behaviors, So it creates this weird counterbalance where work hard, play hard, right? I was succeeding really well academically, but that was just justifying a extreme party lifestyle on the other end.
The work hard, play hard mentality. That's a lot. that's a mouthful for sure.
And Tim, you were saying a little bit about that too, around hiding and having those kind of deeper causes.
That's something that I've seen almost universally in people that struggle with substance abuse. Is hiding is a huge part of it. And that, there's a sense of pride. There's a sense of, I can get away with it. I can handle it. And I think one of the things that I've seen in my career in substance abuse is two primary aspects of substance abuse are isolation and deceit. And I think those are really good evaluative markers. If you could look and say, hey, am I lying about this? Am I hiding this? Then I probably have a problem. And am I doing this by myself? Am I leaving social situations so that I can use on my own? Or do I drink a certain way when I'm around other people, and then I leave the party, and then it's really on? Those are two markers that I think are really helpful in evaluating. Is there something unhealthy about the way I'm doing this?
Yeah, I want to also jump in there. I think isolation is critical. It's a critical thing, and like you said, leaving a party to use more. That was part of my story too. It was like I didn't care about the party. I was all about the after party. The party was just there to figure out who I could bring to the after party, if I could find, a girl I was attracted to or get some friends. But really, like, the goal was just to get like as wasted as possible, up until, whatever, 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. I was way more excited about that than what I was going to. And isolation is also a big one, right? It's like, and I think that's a tough one for use because, and I think for gambling too, because a lot of it can be social. Where it's like you're out there, you're partying, you're having fun. You think you're very extroverted, maybe the substances or the activity makes you extroverted. But then often there is that kind of like that shadow side, right? That backlash where if, your plans fall through, are you still drinking on a Friday night? Like, is that still part of the habit? And the friends, again, are often kind of a justification for those behaviors.
Not to bring it up again, but the work hard, play hard, like, this is what college looks like this is just what it's supposed to be like. And I think specifically for men too, that's a narrative that exists, certainly.
And what you're describing when it gets more isolated, that's exactly where gambling becomes more of the problem too, because when it's social, it's very rarely problematic, or even it can be both. It can be social and it can also be problematic in a private way. But then when you're displaying it socially, people don't know, but then people may start to pick up on that too when they realize, oh, hold on. So it seems like my friend's gravitating towards gambling more on their own than they are with us. I wonder what's going on there. That's when you usually know, oh, there's probably something going on in terms of it's spiraling into something a little bit more problematic for them.
Yeah, and I think, Michael, we were talking about, and we'll get to this now, but it's like that identity component. I think a good kind of marker is when people start to know you based on whatever your substance or pattern of behavior of choice is, right? So like if you have friends and they're like, oh yeah, like Michael really loves poker, like that's your personality, right? Or he like loves sports betting. And you're just kind of known in your friend group, or hey, Mark's a partier. That guy, he's always got cocaine, right? Like you gain like a reputation for the pattern. And I think for young men in particular, when we're all struggling to figure out who we are and to figure out how to differentiate ourselves and figure out how to like be cool, and have something that's just ours. I mean, these are normal kind of developmental steps. If the thing that you picked, and this is true for me, right? If the thing that you picked was drugs, it gets harder to relinquish, because not only is that, have an addiction quality to it, it's also your identity, right? Like, I liked being the guy who had the shit, right? I liked being the guy that could get you whatever you wanted, and the guy that could sell you the drug if you needed, or the guy that could connect you with somebody that could get you something, right? That felt powerful for me. I mean, as a young man, that's status. So it's not just giving up the substance and not just giving up the addiction. It's also really fragmenting your identity, which is already so fragile as a young adult.
And your community too, right? Like and I think that could be said maybe across addiction behaviors, of just like you surround yourself with people that either, don't question that behavior, or who appreciate it, or who they themselves feel like they benefit from it. So it's hard to extricate yourself from that when you're saying, well, I'm creating isolation if I try to work on this in some ways. And that can feel really hard to move against.
So I'm curious, as we're kind of tapping into these topics, what are some of the deeper underlying issues that you think lead to addictive behavior? And again, question B, do you think that all addicts are traumatized? Does there need to be something deeper? Or can an addiction or a dependency behavior exist in a vacuum?
I think that's a really interesting question because it's hard to identify if it exists in the vacuum because there is always some type of response or interaction with your environment. That there is, in the same way that like addiction behavior can create community, it can also create isolation. So it doesn't mean that the absence of one necessarily creates the other. But I would say if we look at addiction behavior as coping strategy, then I would almost always say that there's something underneath. Does it have to be, I use this with my patients of saying like trauma with a capital T versus trauma with a lowercase t. Like, does it have to be something so traumatic that you have a diagnosis of PTSD and this is how you're coping with it? Certainly not. Like it could be, from being a latchkey kid to having a really bad breakup. I think that there could be things as well that impact us in ways that maybe we don't process immediately, and that whatever addiction behavior we fall into, puts a stopper in that. And I think that that's where a lot of the there's a stereotype or a narrative that folks with addiction are locked in the age in which the addiction became, it's worse or it's most prevalent. And I think part of that is not because they stop growing emotionally, but because there's something related to that time that has not been fully processed. And that's, I'm a dynamic practitioner. A lot of my work is on early experiences and how they affect us now. So this is why I think addiction was really important to me to work with. Is the more that I learned about it, the more, my specific take was it does not have to be some huge trauma, but more often than not, in my experience, there's always something around that time that is related to the use or was related to the use, and it might be something different now.
Yeah, one thing I hear a lot is people saying like, well, I don't have any trauma. Like that's not part of the reason. And I loved you explaining, Jack, the big T trauma, little T traumas, because a lot of people, and I would say the majority of people that I work with, there is some, we refer to as complex trauma, is that I wasn't beaten, I wasn't sexually abused, I wasn't, left outside of the house, but every day there was something that was teaching me I'm not important. My feelings aren't important. What I think, what I say, what I want isn't important. And people don't understand that on a long-term basis, that becomes traumatic, and that we learn about ourselves that we're just useless, and that creates emotional pain. And a lot of people don't understand that alcohol is a fantastic emotional anesthetic. And some people drink alcohol and it's fun and it's great. And some people drink alcohol and they go, oh, wow, that feels good. And they don't even know that they've been in emotional pain their whole lives, but they know what it feels like when it goes away.
That's a very valid point. And when I look at people who are struggling with gambling addiction in particular, it's a bit of both too, right? You've got people who have a big T trauma history. You have people who have a small T, more of a complex trauma history. And then I think a really important piece to this too is the gambling itself becomes its own form of trauma. Okay. That whole experience with it is traumatic. And that is universal for everyone who's had a gambling addiction, or maybe we can even generalize to the other addictions. Your addiction itself is going to be a trauma. And that's something that you're going to have to work through as well. And underlying that, right? And you feel like you want to escape from the trauma, and then you end up going back using the device of the addiction to try to escape from the trauma, and it causes more trauma. So underlying, it's really a trap in that way, but underlying it, I believe, and to Tim's point, it's something about not feeling enough, not feeling important, not feeling seen, heard, and validated that contributes to a less stable sense of internal self-worth. And maybe not in every case, but I think in a lot of cases, especially those who say, oh, I don't have any real trauma history, there's a semblance of this, of this internal self-worth that is missing. And it's tied to external things. It's tied to like my work, my performance, outcomes, results, success. It's tied to getting approval from other people. And it becomes even tied to the devices of the addiction itself, right? And so I think that like a really important piece to the recovery journey, and maybe this is more of a universally speaking, because I do believe that this is quite common, and it's also something that hasn't been explored enough, is being able to help someone arrive at the point where they have more of that strong, internally sourced sense of self-worth. And it can come from different places. Let's be clear. It can come from, for some people, it's religion. For other people, it's spirituality. And then you have other purpose-driven elements of their life that are informing their self-worth. For others, it's just really getting to like a more humanistic sense of an internal sense of self. So for me, it matters like less what the actual source is. It matters that it's internalized for someone, because once it's internalized, then they won't be outsourcing as much, and they won't be looking externally for it from anywhere else, from their work, from their performance, from alcohol, from gambling, from pornography. They won't be going to that because they won't feel the need for that anymore.
Yeah. So I want to like double down and double click, zoom in on that, right? Of the shame component, right? Because I'm hearing as we're talking about, Michael, right? Is that I think of many people that struggle with addictions have this internalized shame. And I loved what you said. And I just want to just highlight that, where I think a lot of people, me included, right, when I was in recovery, you use a substance to get rid of the shame feeling, but then it creates more shame. So it creates this like loop that is really, really damaging. And towards the end of my own personal addiction, all I was doing was using, so I had shame in other aspects of my life. I was ashamed that I wasn't really dating, or when I was, it would just kind of hookups and never really went anywhere. I wasn't in good physical shape, right? I wasn't exercising because I was just using all the time. I had lost a number of friends because they distanced themselves from me, being like, whoa, this guy's kind of a little off the rails, So it just creates more feeders of shame. And I want to say something that I don't get to say as much as I love to on camera, but I think our industry is so anti-shame that it thinks shame is the enemy. But I actually disagree. I think shame is telling you have to make a change, right? It's telling you that you are living counter to your values, or counter to your idea of a good life, right? It's your conscience, really, right? I mean, shame is your conscience. But back to what I was saying, I think when you're trying to medicate the shame feeling without taking the meaningful action to actually kill the shame and resolve that emotional crisis, that's when it becomes really dangerous, because you're not really working on the things that maybe you should actually be ashamed about, right? But that requires recovery and repair. You're just trying to make yourself feel better, right? You're taking like a pacifier instead of dealing with the deeper work. So I'm curious for each of you, what do you think the role of shame is in addiction? How do you help clients overcome shame? And just kind of, I guess, wax poetic on the shame factor, because I think that is so deeply ingrained with the addiction recovery journey.
I talk about shame ad nauseum. I'm like champing at the bit to talk about shame at all hours of the day, because it's beginning of my practice with substance use was working with a lot of men who were using drugs to have the type of sex that they wanted to have, but didn't feel like they were able to have it sober. And that spiraled obviously into so many different facets of shame that exist. And I think you're so right about being in a field that tries to, in its own way, eliminate or douse shame, when we're also preaching the method of every emotion is valid. Everything you feel is information and something you feel. So it really does become changing the brain, or, Michael, to your point of internalizing in some way. Shame can exist without it needing to be eliminated, because that's what using on top of the shame does. Like, well, I can make this go away for a little bit. It's always going to come back, but I found a way to stamp it out for a period of time that usually just gets shorter and shorter and shorter. And, then at some point there does have to be a look of, this is no longer, this coping strategy is no longer serving me. But to normalize shame, but also, Mark, to your point of, what is it actually telling you? Because I think what a lot of people interpret in the beginning is that, well, it's telling me that I'm a piece of shit. It's telling me that I'm not worthy, or that I don't deserve this, or that I should continue to destroy my life if that's what I feel like I'm doing. But to reframe shame as, no, this is just like anxiety is a useful emotion in the right amount. Like, shame is a useful emotion in the right amount to let you know this is not working for me, or I don't like the way that this feels, rather than it being used as, a way to just induce self-harm, I think a lot of the time.
And I think, our kind of talk about a lot on the show, our straw man validation therapist, which I think is unfortunately a lot of therapists and why a lot of men bounce off therapy is that, if a client comes to you and they're saying, hey, I'm feeling ashamed that I might have date raped somebody. I might have gotten them really intoxicated and had sex without consent. Or I stole from my parents, right? I stole their credit cards so that I could buy microtransactions in my cell phone game, and I feel ashamed. I think the straw man therapist, what a lot of guys get is being like, oh, you did the best you could. It's not your fault. It's your trauma. It's something else. And I think there's an element of truth to that, but it also can be really enabling. Where sometimes it's yeah, maybe you shouldn't have date raped somebody, right? Maybe you shouldn't have stolen your parents' credit card. Let's talk about how to recover from that and how to come clean and how to live a life of integrity rather than just validating whatever behavior tends to come through the door.
And that's the weaponization of therapy speak. That's that insidious place where that comes in at that point as well. And to that point also, if this is a whole nother topic, so I don't want to derail this topic as well, but ChatGPT is also giving that absolute positive loop feed, which, again, a topic for another time. But I think it's interesting that there is kind of this idea of, just feeding in the positivity and you did nothing wrong. And that's because of all these things. It's maybe it's worth investigating, but again, not to an extreme. You don't have to completely destroy yourself off of having this feeling, but maybe it's worth looking at.
I believe there's definitely a problem with this excessive validation, right? We validate everything without an anchor. And then part of that too is, validation can be important, but it's also about confrontation. So you have to be able to balance this. And I believe a lot of maybe a lot of therapists, they find that difficult because, and I've heard this discussed in kind of the in other settings with the men's therapy online, the kind of the contrast between being nice and being kind, right? So I think there's too much nice with therapists and with AI, right? And there's not enough kind, where sometimes kind means you got to push back, right? Sometimes it means you gotta be willing to go there with someone because you're putting the relationship first, and that relationship, you can rely on that more than anything in terms of how we get to a process of change and really moving things forward. But then when I think about shame, it's kind of I think the same way about there's parts of ourselves, right? There's maybe more of an addiction mode, and there's more of a recovery mode, and there's kind of modes within those modes too. I think of shame in a similar way. You've got more of your toxic shame, which is the one that we've been talking about, but we also have more of this, what I call appropriate shame, where this shame is good for you. You need this shame. This shame, is not telling you there's something wrong with you. It's really helping you to kind of become not even focusing on just getting to the point where I'm not trying to do this anymore. It's my shame is trying to help me become someone that realizes this is not who I am anymore. I am growing out of this. I am evolving, and I'm going through a process, and appropriate shame is fully part of that process. And we have to know how to use that, not only as, someone who's suffering from addiction, but also as people, professionals who are helping folks with addiction recovery. I think we have to get a better understanding of what appropriate shame is and how we use that to everyone's benefit.
Yeah, I think that a concept that's been really helpful for a lot of my clients is being able to distinguish between guilt and shame. And I think that's something that I've heard in what you were saying, Michael, is that there's a difference between the two. And a lot of people have never heard that concept. And for me, the idea of guilt is I did something wrong, and shame is there's something wrong with me. Guilt is I fucked up, and shame is I am fucked up. And that there's a distinction between those two. And guilt is really important because you need to be able to acknowledge when you've made a mistake so that you can rectify it. And so one of the ways that shame could be an indicator, as you were saying, Mark, is it could be an indication of a problem with the relationship with yourself. When you see everything in the world, especially when people come to you, and that's how can get in the way of relationships. When people come to you and say, hey, I didn't like it when you did that, or hey, I thought that was inappropriate. If your response is a shame response, you're going to get defensive and you're going to say, well, what are you talking about? I did the best I could. There's nothing I could do. Why are you getting on me? But if you can recognize guilt of, oh, I made a mistake, you can rectify it and say, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to do that. And so being able to distinguish the two and decide what's the appropriate response here? Is there something wrong with me? Do I need to find a therapist and work on this? Or do I just need to recognize that I messed up and it's okay and I need to make amends?
And being safe, having that conversation with yourself to identify nuance, because some people are so scared of feeling the shame of this says something about me internally that it's almost easier just to turn it off or to not think about it or to look away. So acknowledging the work of even trying to look at that is huge. Case study that I use with my interns a lot is a client that I had that, was working on moderating drinking and would come to session and would say, part of what stops me from drinking is I don't want to sit here and be ashamed when I tell you that I drank more than I wanted to. And it was a really interesting dynamic of looking at if your therapist is weaponizing shame, leave that therapist. But to ask if there's anything that I'm doing that's giving them that impression that I feel that way, but more about that was what he responded to, is that his life revolved around shame and shaping the way that he moved around in the world. And so really having that dichotomy of there's a great therapy component of this. There's something really rich here, but also it's being used to help him, reach his goals. So at the same time, working on the shame while also shifting, well, how in future points of your life, when you no longer have this shame as such a barrier, how are you going to keep that desire to not want to drink more or to stick with your goals? So it is an interesting, you're always working in tandem when talking about addiction, because there's always more than one thing happening. I guess that's the rule of thumb that I always try to share with my interns as well.
Yeah, and that dovetails. There's so many. We're gonna have to have you guys back because there's so many questions I can think of. But the one that comes to mind as you're talking, Jack, is another big question: is what does recovery look like? And what I say to my guys is you kind of this assumption that you're using a substance or behavior or an addictive pattern to cope. Right? You're overwhelmed in some way, shape, or form, and using it as a way to tranquilize and self-soothe. Okay. Where I think a lot of therapy, stops and ends is helping you find other coping strategies, which is great, right? I mean, it's good to have more healthier things, going to the gym, journaling, meditation, all that stuff is great. I do it. It's phenomenal. But for me, real recovery is creating a life that you don't have to cope from. And that's a true fundamental, quantum shift of your life. And it usually means a lot of grief, means a lot of, cutting out a lot of things. It's a lot of humility, right? Starting things that you're probably pretty bad at to begin with. And it takes a lot of self-worth and self-love to really think that you're worthy of a life that, God forbid you actually enjoy, rather than having a life you have to cope through. Because I think even people that are, quote unquote, psychologically healthy are living lives that they don't really enjoy. They're living lives that are causing so much pain and strife, and they're needing to just constantly recover from their own life and constantly just buffer themselves to get to work every day. And I think even though those people may not be addicts, they're still in the same kind of bucket. So I'm curious for each of you, what does recovery look like? Perhaps what's your definition? And what does the pathway look like for somebody that does want to break free from some of these addictive cycles?
One of my favorite groups to run when I'm doing group therapy is called Red Balloon, Black Balloon. And I talk about the idea that our black balloon is all the things that we did in addiction. What's addiction made up of? And it's made up of all the lies and all the isolation and all the disconnection. And then the red balloon is the things that we love about life, the things that feed us, our relationships, laughing, being out in nature, and all these things. And a lot of people want to shrink down the black balloon and by focusing on it and saying, okay, I have to stop doing this. I have to stop doing that. I have to go to more meetings. I have to call my sponsor. I have to. And in my mind, the best way to shrink down that black balloon is to blow up the red balloon and to focus on what are the things that I love? What are the things that when I put energy into them, they give energy back to me? And for me, that's the idea of recovery. It's not to look at how do I not do something, but what am I doing? Like you said, Mark, what am I moving toward? What is my life? And for me, that's recovery. Is I'm figuring out where I want to go, what I want to do. I'm exploring things that, like I said, give me energy when I put energy into them. And I'm not just looking at the shame and looking at the guilt and the things I've done, because when you focus on that and focus on not, I always feel like that's a terrible goal setting strategy. Never focus on what you don't want to do. There's always a way to say, okay, what do I want to do? And make that the focus. So, and I'll actually bring in balloons and have people blow them up and shrink them and talk about, like, where are you right now? Blow the red balloon up and shrink the black one and talk about a time when you felt this way. Now blow the black one up really big. And sometimes we'll get deep and, talk about the worst thing you've ever done, and then let that balloon go and just let it go and move on to the red. And so for me, that's recovery, is shifting from the focus on what you've done and where you've been, and shifting the focus to where you're trying to get to, and learning what are the things that help me get there.
And to Marc's point, like, the recovery is not the coping strategies. Your recovery is not the way that you learn to cope. It is the life that you're building, what you're moving towards, all of those things that are much more deep and easier to sink your teeth into.
The balloons, I love that, because the balloons are the modes, right? Like, you're really helping them shift from one mode to another, but then also realize that sometimes it's a bit of both. You got to navigate, you got to maneuver this, and it's not linear. That's what I come back to. And I think we're seeing something really interesting culturally as well. Like, and I'm sure you guys have seen it, and the listeners have as well, where we have this rise of recovery content, okay, on different platforms, podcasts, right? Long form conversations. Like, I'll give you some that come to my mind. Like, in the gambling space, specifically, there's one called the Addicted Recovery Show by Daniel Bullen, and then he's got guests on there that are telling their addiction and their recovery stories. And that's like evolving recovery, right? Like, it's actually broadcasting it and making it, like, it's overcoming the shame in some sense as well. And it's not just like, oh, we have these media resources that provide some sort of education or psychoeducation. It's the real thing. And I think that resonates with a lot of people now. And we're seeing that just in how these channels are growing. And then people really get connection from this too. Especially when they see and hear someone's story, they're like, oh, that's me, or like, or that's worse than me, or they get me, like, the host really gets me. But then I also think of another example where it goes beyond gambling. It's Nothing's Off the Table with Luis Ruggiero Jr. And his focus there is on gambling, but also alcohol, drugs, and just all. And you hear these wild stories of what's actually happened in people's lives. And I think that that's creating a sense of, like, not only resonance for the listeners, but also, like, sure, part of it's entertainment too, right? But then a stronger part of that is identification. Like, some part of them feels seen, heard, and validated. Like, some part of them realize, and some part of and part of what some people do is rely on these podcasts, right, as part of their recovery journey. We would not be saying this like 5 years ago, right, before COVID. I don't think anyone would be saying this, but the reality is, like, it is a part of the toolkit now for a lot of people. And what we're realizing, I think, is people don't just want answers. Like, they want to feel understood. They want and need that connection, even if it's through a podcast. Like, that's where they're finding it. And I think that that's a really neat evolution that we're seeing, in this space of recovery.
Yeah, I'm smiling as you're talking because, and you don't know this, maybe some of our OG listeners, this show, before it was the Men's Therapy Podcast, was called From the Ashes. And then it was a recovery podcast. So I ran a recovery podcast for a good 4 years, like spotlighting people's stories, whether from substance use or from overcoming trauma and things like that. And we got a lot of positive feedback from it because people, like you said, that they got kind of the experience that I got through AA, right? Just being around fellowship, but they got it through the podcast medium, which is becoming more and more popular. And I think, in-person groups, even though I think they are better, frankly, they're on the decline. I think people don't have the time anymore. They don't have the bandwidth to go to recovery group in the same way that, they were popular in the 90s, 80s, and, early 2000s, which is a shame because that's how I came up. And that's how I, got better, was being in that brotherhood and that fellowship. But all that being said, is I agree. It went from Alcoholics Anonymous, right? It went from like people being secretive in a church basement to now broadcasting to anyone and everyone that can listen to the recovery story. It's a wild change. It really is.
But also there's that optionality too, right? Like this just becomes another option, another pathway, part of that recovery journey, because the in-person stuff definitely still important. I think it's going to be play a very critical role in many people's recovery journeys too. It's just about having more and more options, I think, for people and letting them choose ultimately like how they want to position and live out their recovery journey and their story, because that's what we hear from these stories we're seeing on these podcasts, right? It's not one singular way. It's not one linear path. Like it's like people's lives, they've made something out of it and they've lived their journey and their story. And part of that is they want to share it with other people. Like we said, there's many ways you can pass it forward. That's one way a lot of these folks are passing it forward, which I think is very admirable too.
I had a client in his 60s who I was seeing in group, and he said something in group that is kind of my take on what recovery looks like. But he said, when I, through sobriety, my life didn't immediately get better, but it sure gave me a hell of a lot more options to choose to make it better. And so I always kind of lay out this, it sounds slightly nihilistic at the beginning, but like sobriety doesn't guarantee that your life gets better, but it gives you the ability of choice more so than if you hadn't done it. And I think for a lot of people in the very early stages of recovery, it's hard to see out of the work or the difficulty of these things. But that's the powerful part of community recovery support, is that there are other people who can say like, it's here, like it does exist for you, that this is, a process, a journey, any of those, what a client of mine calls bumper sticker statements. But like for someone who actually feels that and can try to connect that in a very real way rather than having it just be a concept. Because the it gets better talk is lost on a lot of people who are like, but I'm struggling right now. Like I want help now. And that's so understandable and so valid, but it is part of the process.
It is still part of the process, and part that needs to just continue to get talked about. One of my sponsor actually told me that, the phase after sobriety, like after you're sober, is quiet desperation. Like you're just like alone, you got no friends. You finally realized, for me, that like I was kind of a loser in some aspects of my life, right? I was behind the curve. I had to really work hard to catch up. Like you finally see life for what it is, what your life is and what you've made of it. And oftentimes, at least in my case, it was disappointing, and it's pain. It's a lot of pain, right? Because the substance and the addictive behavior is what was you kind of tranquilizing you to that pain. So I think a lot of people think it's going to be like sunshine and rainbows and like dancing and screaming from the mountaintops. But for most guys, it's fucking pain. It's a lot of like hard truths and dark realizations. And if you're following, a 12-step path, you're making amends. So now you're going to these people that you hurt and you're telling them that you hurt them, and that freaking sucks. It's a lot of sharp contrast when you first get sober. I'm curious what you all think about that and how you would help somebody navigate in those early stages when they're finally kind of pulling the veil off of their eyes.
Well, I think that's, to your point, the narrative that really, I think, needs to be talked about more in a way. Because I get the sense that some people in the field don't want to broadcast that, rather, because it's going to scare people away from addiction treatment or something like that. But it is the whole point of the treatment is, in its best form, you're surrounding yourself with people that can meet you there. If in the pain or the isolation for the time that it does last, because it isn't forever, for people who can say, well, I'm glad you're here, who can meet that and not necessarily try to force you out of it or try to say like, no, everything is going to be fine. Like, who can just fully meet you there and say, either I've been there, myself, and so I can commiserate, or to say like, you get to show up however you want, and this is not going to change things. It's, re-regulating is such a clinical term, but there really is something powerful about being in a room and kind of feeling like you're falling apart and not having people leave you or not having people want to push you away.
I love that idea of just letting people know, yeah, it does get better, but that doesn't mean right now and not right away, because I think a lot of people are severely disappointed by that. And they say, what are you talking about? This sucks. And I think of a couple of clients right now. Like, I was a lot happier when I was using. I was blowing things up and ruining relationships and destroying my life, but I had friends around. And so I think just by making that apparent that, yeah, this is the hard part. I love what you said, Mark, that it leads to quiet desperation, and that you have to get through that part before you get to, the other pathways and the ways. So just sharing that.
Yeah, but my sponsor had this metaphor of basically like you're crawling out of hell, and when you climb up the ladder, you're just in like a cold, dark room that's empty, and like it's great because like, I mean, you're not in hell. But then the next step is like starting to turn the lights on, starting to tidy up the room, starting to like decorate it, starting to actually build a life that you want. But you don't come out of hell and just start in heaven, right? You have to start in this like kind of like limbo place.
And that's not to say, and I'm becoming one of these clinicians that's like, don't broadcast this. But it doesn't mean to say that there isn't, joys or things to be proud about, or, things that you internalize along the way, obviously. But I think that that's an important note too, of just like getting to share that with, again, your people, or for me personally, like getting to share that moment with a client when it does feel like a lot of the times it is quiet desperation, getting to share those moments where things feel stable or even good, or, in whatever way, like that's a really powerful and impactful moment as well.
Part of the work I'm doing now with Incumental is actually like trying to move this more upstream, because a lot of what we talk about, the post rock bottom, very downstream, right? Like, and then the interventions. I mean, we could debate this as well, but it seems like that they come at a point where it's like, well, wouldn't it have been better if it was a lot earlier? But then a lot earlier, we wouldn't have been looking for it in the same way or feeling compelled in the same way. But actually, we're starting to see a shift already in what we're doing, like just providing through our recovery experience platform, a private support app where people who maybe have had some of the earlier, the series in the series of rock bottoms, they've had maybe the first few chapters, but they haven't had the last few chapters of rock bottoms yet. And they are actually getting on the app, and they're actually engaging, and they're still doing it privately. And we're trying to do it in two ways primarily there, which is building that anonymous and private connection, but really have it also kind of have an element there of like coaching support of like, hey, like we're here to help you. Like you don't need to worry about no stigma about this. Like we're here for you. Just let us know when you're ready. Just let us know when this and when that. And then the other part is really knowing that a lot of the struggle through the whole process, no matter where you are in that journey, is dealing with those urges. When you have those urges, what do you do? Like, how do you navigate them? And again, a lot of folks don't have the tools to do that. So we try to provide that in a very specific and specialized way in our app, so that we have sessions that actually guide people towards breaking their urges, towards like navigating them in a different way than they're used to. So now they not only have access to it, but they also have the tools for it. So we've really tried to create something that can meet people more upstream. And we're starting to see some shifts already, which I think is great, because especially with how gambling is spiraling at a societal level, like we're going to need more and more support, right? And then gambling and the comorbidities too, they go hand in hand, because often quoted statistic is that like 50% of people who have gambling disorder also have some sort of substance use, alcohol, or comorbidity diagnosis. So, I mean, there's a really big a problem, and there's a really big opportunity here, especially what we're seeing in the gambling space. And we're just trying to do whatever we can to make it more casual too, right? To be like, hey, you don't need to feel like we're necessarily a treatment facility. We're not, we're not providing licensed mental health care. We're just providing support. Like you can feel like you can just come in at any point. And that's often what people are looking for. I know with gambling, right? People often, they're online when they're dealing with the private problem, they're looking for the private solution. And historically, they haven't really found it. And I'm hoping to position ourselves at Incumental as at least one of those options for a private solution, that we can start working through it. And maybe it means they have to go through the other options too, depending on where they are in their life and what they need. That's okay. We're just trying to help people, support them, connect them to whatever resources and other options may be helpful, but also just help them through that journey, even before it gets to that, to the end of the rock bottom story.
Yeah. And I think a lot of this, the boom of recovery content, therapy content, Instagram influencers, TikTokers. I mean, it's everywhere, which is, I think, ultimately good. I think net positive. There's definitely some negatives to it, but I think it's net positive for that reason, Michael, that you're talking about, of hopefully we catch these things more upstream, right? If they're talked about more, if they're destigmatized, if people are seeing, they can go on a podcast or a TikTok and they can see where their life might be headed if they don't intervene early. I think that is shifting the culture. And we're seeing, Gen Z, right, are using drugs and alcohol so much less than every generation before them. Granted, they're moving more into things like gambling and gaming, and vaping, right? But drugs and alcohol are way, 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 way down, because I think they do have, in general, more higher EQs. They've seen their parents go through struggles, and their parents be more open about it. They're consuming more of this, therapy content. So I think they're more aware just of like what it could look like, and they're making different choices. So the second to last question that I'm going to ask, as we're kind of moving toward the end here, is, in each of your opinions, what is the role of spirituality in recovery? I think it's an important topic and something that a lot of men, especially young men, bounce off of, right? They're like, hey, I don't believe in God. I don't want to go to an AA meeting. It's not going to be all Bible banging or whatever. Like I think it's actually a barrier for people to get into recovery. I will say my answer is, I think it's critical, whether you like it or not. I think spirituality is critical. I don't think it has to be religion or a god or deity worship, but when we talk about the strength and the I say this, the I don't want to say, like, I would say things, the tenets, I guess, that it takes to do recovery successful, they are things that are beyond the human, right? It's these really powerful morals, like, humility, right? You really have to be humble for this shit to work at all. You got to be able to really look at yourself in the mirror and be honest. You have to have faith. You have to have faith that, like, it's going to suck right now, but it's going to get better. Without faith, you're not going to be able to do it. And it takes real deep connection and intimacy, which I think is a spiritual trait of being able to connect first with yourself and then ultimately with other people around you. And I think those things, each of those, are a spiritual path in of themselves. And I do think, at least in my opinion, is it takes some sort of spiritual practice or commitment or forward North Star to be able to stay consistent, to build those things. Those things are freaking hard. They're really, really hard, and they're really painful. And in some ways, they might even be unnatural, right? They're not kind of tied to the kind of human animal instincts, right? You have to kind of push beyond what your pleasure-seeking monkey brain wants to do to become a better person. And for me, that is a spiritual pursuit, right? I mean, that is something that is beyond the human. So I'm curious for each of you, and of course, feel free to disagree. Do you believe that spirituality is a critical part of the recovery process?
I absolutely do. And when I look at the 12 steps, it just seems plain as day to me. Here is a plan for how you turn your life over to God or your higher power, or we all have different ideas of who and what God is. But that's what it is. It's a playbook. Here's how you do it, because that's what's been found is 12 steps is one of the only things that actually works. And I think that is why. And I think you hit on it, Mark. It's like, I don't need to just know that I need to get better. How do I do it? How do you go through this journey and to have it all broken down and say, this is how you let go. Here's how you turn it over to something higher. And here's how you feel like everything's okay, even when you screw up again, even when everything feels like nothing is going right. How do you find something to believe that, hey, maybe I will get through this? Because it takes that kind of faith. It takes that kind of optimism to get there.
Yeah. And for the people out there, because again, like, for me, God wasn't the thing, but my higher power was the present moment. And I was intentionally studying Buddhism at the time. And I was like, look, my faith is I just need to be present. I need to be awake. And I need to be alive. And if I can move towards that, if that can be something that I can surrender to and really anchor myself around, then it's worth it, right? There's something for me there. And one of the big moments, many big moments in my recovery, was realizing and admitting to myself and to my therapist at the time that I was high more often than I was sober. And I kind of forgot what it was like to be sober, because I was just always high, literally always high for like a decade. And that was very, very scary. So for me, my higher power when I was going through AA was like, I need to get back to reality, and everything will kind of follow from there, because I was aware of how delusional and how intoxicated and how just like spun out I was for a long time, for like a decade of my life, a developmentally critical decade of my life. I was not in reality. And that was very humbling.
I mean, I think spirituality, to the extent that that is, either God or Mark, like you're saying, the present moment, like there is this aspect of it is something, outside of yourself. Even if it is you, it is still the idea of you. Like the ability to say that there's something outside of myself that I'm working with or working through, regardless of if you're seeking sobriety or harm reduction or whatnot. Like one of the tenets of 12-step is, that there's this admittance of powerlessness. And rather than having that be something that I think a lot of people read as saying like, again, well, why even try? If I'm powerless, then why even look into this? It's like your higher power could be your, the dopamine reward system. Like it could just be this acknowledgement of like, there is something enacting outside of myself that I have to be consciously aware of. If that's, going over the amount of drinks that I want to have or using more than I want to use, whatever it might be. But you have to put yourself outside of yourself in any way, shape, or form to be able to observe yourself. And I think for a lot of people, God and maybe a default spirituality in that way is an easier way to do that, because the data shows that is effective. Like using community recovery or sports, having a religious inclination is associated with better results, but it's not the only thing available to you. So that's why I would tell people who go to 12-step meetings, but they say, but I'm not religious. It's like, well, then get something else out of that. Like, is there a way? Go to Smart Recovery, try that out. Like, there's other versions of that out there, but the whole point is that you're no longer trapped in just being you. Because for a lot of people, if you've received the messaging, both from other people, but also to yourself, that, to quote you again, tell them like, I'm a piece of shit. Like, you're not going to want to exist in you. You're not maybe going to have the hooks to say like, well, I do believe in a better life for myself, or I do believe that I can change. So maybe at the beginning, it does come from more external components, but the therapy, in my opinion, then at that point is to join those things together in a way that is, useful and productive for the future, regardless of that be religion, spirituality, or just the belief in yourself to be able to change.
What I said earlier about self-worth, I mean, ultimately, that is the relationship with yourself. And I think that relationship is key in all of this. So, we talk whether it's relationship with God or higher power, but I probably would frame it more as like with the transcendent, right? Because the transcendent includes all of those. See, like whether we can frame it in religion and spirituality, it's something that's transcendent to you. And that could be relationships with the other. It could be relationships with the world, right? Like the physical world that we are connecting to. And I think a lot of mindful approaches embrace transcendence in that way too. So for me, it's like, how do we have that relationship, not within ourselves, but also kind of creating that real bridge with these transcendent parts of us too, and do that in a really healthy and balanced way, and keep moving towards that. Again, it's not like, oh, it's either unhealthy or it's healthy. It's not it's like we're working through a process here, and the transcendent, however you want to define that, I believe is inherently a part of that process and is inherently a part of our self-worth as well.
I think that's all well said. And I'd encourage listeners, if they're curious, reach out to us, Fin Therapy Online, chat about that. Tim, Jack, and I are available to talk about that role, because I know that is such a barrier for so many men, especially young men, right? Because I think we're moving further and further away from religion and spirituality. And that comes with some real consequences, right? It comes with some real barriers, I think, for people connecting. So as our final question, I want to ask you all, if a listener is tuning in and they are inspired by this conversation, what is an action that they can take right away? Something they can do that is courageous, that is quick, and that can help them orient somewhere on this path of recovery. The one that I was going to bring up is ask someone in your life. In fact, ask a few people if they think you have a problem. Ask your friends, ask your family members, ask your spouse, ask your partner if they think you have a problem. Because, and I've said it a bunch of times on the show, I think many men, to their detriment, lack honest mirrors. I think a lot of people don't give men feedback because of our privileged position, because of the fact that we can sometimes be intimidating, we can be defensive, we can shut down, we can push people away. A lot of people are not honest with men, truly honest, especially about things that are more vulnerable, right? And then things that are maybe perceived as weakness. So if you do have a good relationship with your friends, your family, your partner, and you think they can be honest with you, ask them, because they may be thinking that, but they may not yet have the courage to bring it up. And if you can open the door, you might be able to start having more honest conversations with the people that really matter to you about these types of things. So that'd be my advice, is ask, hey, do you think I have a problem with gambling, with alcohol, with marijuana? And hopefully the people can be honest. Hopefully they take that invitation to be courageous themselves and give you true feedback. Because that's what makes men stronger, is being able to really incorporate feedback from people that we trust and respect.
Yeah, I've mentioned it before, but I would definitely say, like, look up, Google motivational interviewing questions, go through some of them, answer them yourself, look up the stages of change, talking about making men stronger. Like, the best way I think that you can do that is to arm yourself with information about something that is not widely talked about in a way that is beneficial, as much as it's talked about in ways of like, this is what it should be, or, there's, I think, some beneficial statement of like, this is what worked for me. But when it's done in the sense of, this is what worked for me and this is the only way to do it, always take some hesitancy with that. So find your own resources, look up things. Like I mentioned Smart Recovery. I think a lot of folks in recovery don't know that that's another version of community recovery support. So learning the language, there's so much of this that's inside baseball that, when I talk to clients in early recovery about, they're like, oh, I didn't know that I had a lapse versus a relapse, or I didn't know, some of these, triggers, people, places, things, playing the tape through, like all of these things that are so, fly off the tongue. I think of some people, like sometimes it's helpful for you to know this before entering recovery as well, just to say like, oh, I've got some language to define what's going on in my life, rather than feeling like it's just chaos.
And read Jack's blog.
And read my blog. I'm talking about all this on my blog.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the blog he did for MTO, it's live now. I'll put a link to it. It's about stages of change. It goes through a lot of this terminology. It's a phenomenal primer if you're just curious about what the pathway might look like for you.
I think my advice would be become a scientist. And what I mean by that is, one of the books I read in grad school said, there's a test for if you're an addict or not. And if you're doing something that you don't want to be doing, then stop. And if you can't, then you're an addict. And I kind of like the simplicity of that. But what I really liked was, if you're doing something that you don't think you should be doing, or you're wondering if it's a harmful, change a variable and then absolutely notice what's happening. Not through your defensive lens, not through your self-preserving lens, not through your concern for what other people think lens, but from an actual objective perspective. And say, hey, when I tried to stop, here's what happened. And what does that tell me? Because so many of those things get in the way of us actually seeing what's going on. And if you can do that and just kind of, which breaks down to being honest with yourself. And if you can just really be honest with yourself, then step into the next step, Mark, reach out, talk to somebody, because now you know in yourself, okay, it's time to reach out for help. And that's when I see people make a shift, is when they can finally reach out for help. And I think that's something that's key to getting there, is being honest with yourself.
And I just want to just amplify that a little bit of like, we do values exercise all the time as therapists, right? And honesty is definitely the number one value that I think most of my male clients put on the list, is honesty. And I think there is something inherently masculine or just inherently human about valuing honesty, about wanting to be honest. I think that is one of those spiritual values that is worth pursuing. So I think if you can be more honest in your life, it will make you a better man, whether it's in this arena of addiction recovery or just in life, right? In any other arena. Like, honesty is such a powerful and courageous vehicle for self-growth. So I like that you brought that up, Tim. Michael, how about you? What's something that someone could do right away to start to chip away at this bear?
My message is, you don't have to earn your worth. You already own your worth. And that's something you have to experience. Those aren't just words that you apply. You could go talk to someone about that. Like, what does that mean? What do I think it means? You could even go and ask your AI of platform of choice, like, what does that mean? But that's an experience and that's a journey. So I hope you can go on that journey and have that experience and really come to understand what that means. You don't have to earn your worth. You already own your worth.
I love that. It makes you think of another thing that my sponsor used to say, which was, everyone gears up to make a leap of faith, and then by the time they jump, they realize they're already on the ground. It's like you're already there. You just have to realize that you're there already. So all y'all, I've really enjoyed this conversation. I feel like we could have kept going. I will be doing this again. So I'd love to have each and every one of you back. But as we're wrapping up here, if people want to follow you online, if they want to learn more about you and what you do, where can they find you? And Tim, you want to kick us off on that one first?
Yeah, I am on Men's Therapy, so you can get it at Men's Therapy online. You can also look at my website at timmullinscounseling.com.
Great. And Michael, how about you?
I love connecting with people on LinkedIn. So you can search Dr. Michael Zhang. I would love to connect with you there. But also, if you do need support with gambling, recovery, or prediction markets, I'll add that in there. Then please go to incumental.com and you can download the app there, and we'll be happy to help onboard you and work with you.
And Jack, how about yourself?
Yeah, I'm on Instagram, Jack Knows Best. My website is jacklambert.lmhc.org. And I'm also on MTO.
I loved having you all on. And listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. As you know, Men's Therapy Podcast is part of Men's Therapy Online. All of our stuff is at menstherapy.online. You can find episodes with all of these fine folks, multiple, in fact. You can find blogs written by them. And we have so much content that you can really tailor it to what you want. We just actually updated our content library that now it is searchable by different categories. And one of them is addiction. So you can go there, check out our content library, click the addiction button, and you'll see, I think it's like 10 pages. It's like an insane amount of shit, right? Like you'll see more content than you can even read on addiction. We have from every angle, every substance. We cover it all. And the last thing I want to say is we've talked about the importance of fellowship, of brotherhood, of community. And that's something we also offer at MTO. We have a free Slack channel that is open to everyone that is interested. We're at about 300 guys right now, and the goal is to get to 1,000 by the end of the year. There is no charge. There is no commitment for that. It's just an opportunity to connect with other guys that are doing this type of work, that are ready to be honest, ready to be courageous, and want a better life for themselves and the people around them. If you're looking for friends, if you're looking for accountability, if you're looking for inspiration, check out our Slack channel. Again, it's a way to get in contact with, I think all of us are on it right now. So it's a way to get in contact with all of us. You can message us, ask us questions. And there's also a community of guys that are constantly supporting each other. It is wonderful to see this community growing and to see guys really connecting and being honest and talking about what's really going on. That's what the world needs, and we're here to provide that for you. So that is at menstherapy.online. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next week, another episode of the Men's Therapy Podcast.